Welcome back to the MidMasq channel. Welcome back to the MidMasq channel. Today we're talking about Dungeons and Dragons as always, but with the conclusion of my campaign, or the near conclusion of my campaign that I have been running for about 3 years now, I thought I would like to share the 5 lessons that I learned in my own personal campaign. The campaign I've been running is a very strange setting, set in a world where everything's been torn apart and is only now just getting it back together. Magic is super overly common in that world on purpose. You can be walking in the desert, what's that in the sand? A magical sword? Wow, look, it even lights on fire! Who would have thought? But this campaign has been a very interesting, fun, and yet difficult path for me to take. So, without further ado, here's a couple of the things that I learned that might assist you in your campaign. One of the first mistakes that I ever made, and I recommend you steer clear of, is just jumping straight into a crazy plot point. I was so enthusiastic to start my campaign that essentially the first 5 minutes of session 1, my first ever session, were basically just spent throwing the party into a plot point. This gave them very little time to interact with one another, to learn each other's characters and what they're all about, and so on and so forth. And because I rushed this plot point with a bunch of bandits raiding the village and kind of began to rush things along almost immediately, it kind of came out messy and not exactly the way I envisioned, and I overall was not satisfied with the end result. So I recommend you take things slow in your first session, but maybe allude to an upcoming battle or an upcoming raid, so the party has a little bit of time to prepare for fun and interesting plans. It also gives them time to interact with one another, learn each other's characters, a little bit of their backstories, or if you're an edgy rogue, you get to allude to your backstory. And obviously, if your players want to jump straight into some crazy adventure, they usually initiate that themselves. So you don't need to feel pressured into just slamming them with a plot point right away, because if they're chasing a plot point like that quickly, they'll do it themselves. Another important lesson that I learned during my creation of my campaign, my first ever campaign, is I actually did not fill out the very basics. And you would be surprised how easy it is to forget these. Things like the names of the days, the months, the eras, the years, the wars, and so on, and even the gods to some extent, can be a very easy thing to look over. It wasn't until my players finally asked, hey, what month is it? What day is it? How long has it been since we started our adventure? I was sitting there thinking, I don't even know what year it is. Which obviously is a big mistake on my part. Something I could have taken care of a lot better. And that's why I recommend you don't make the same mistake. It was an important lesson that, hey, before I even start a campaign, I should have things like days, months, years, and when things generally happened already filled out ahead of time. It doesn't need to be super detailed, just enough to tell the players where they are in time and how far away the war that decimated the entire world was. The next lesson that I learned was actually asking for player feedback. I kind of learned this on my own after I noticed a lot of the characters and players not interacting as much as I wished they would. Or perhaps they were interacting in ways that weren't making them super happy or weren't working with me very well. So I asked them what could be improved, what could be changed, and parts of D&D that they liked and parts of D&D they didn't like. Some players really don't like certain rules, and sometimes the DM, you or me, particularly don't like another set of rules. So not only is it a great lesson and a great set of experience to kind of make your own edits to the rules, but it can lead to a more satisfying end result for your campaign. I've mentioned this before, many players don't like stunned, for example, so changing stunned into something else might be beneficial for you. Or perhaps a lot of the players don't like how counter spell works, or they don't like the fact that this villain that you have can just... Or perhaps your players don't like how when you wake up in the morning as a spellcaster, you have to pick from an entire selection of spells and hope to the gods that you pick the right spells for the right day for the right adventure. These were actually a couple rules my players did not like too much, so I opted to give them a bit of my own mixing. And also, editing rules generally just gets you more familiarized with them. So, after all, it's a win-win-win situation. The next lesson that I learned, and I learned the hard way, is do not underestimate your players. What I mean by this is, do not underestimate the fact that they absolutely will, derail any plan you've made in a linear fashion. If you think the players are going to go to A, B, and C in sequence just like that, with absolutely no interruptions, you are very likely wrong. Some parties may follow this, but many will not. So instead of making A, B, and C all have to be followed in sequence for that adventure to work, expect your players to just do something crazy. Expect them to just go from A to C to B, and maybe back to A for whatever reason. So instead of having this linear path, make it more of a, you can go to A, B, and C all separately on your own time. But doing so will progress whatever plot or story or encounter that you have in mind. And also when I say don't underestimate your players, is don't underestimate how they will fare in combat. It can be very easy to look at your villain and be like, maybe he's a little too strong. Let's lower the damage numbers a little bit. Maybe he has too much health or too much armor class. Let's take that down too. And then you put the villain in front of the players, and that villain just gone. If perhaps your villain during the encounter is definitely too overtuned because of this kind of line of thinking, where you're like, maybe I shouldn't be so soft on my players. Maybe this villain should be just super tough and super AC, super health, super damage, and so on and so forth. During the fight, you can always have the players weaken him in some ways, which is, on the fly, an easier thing to do. He just gets hit enough times, he's like, oh, his magical abilities are waning. Whoa, he does less damage now. So don't worry about overtuning, but worry a little more perhaps about undertuning. Unless you overtune to the point where you can literally one-hit your party, so maybe keep in mind their health and armor class scores. The next lesson I learned, and this is a very different sort of lesson, is collect things that inspire you. And when I say collect things, I don't mean just like, ooh, I like this jar of change. Wow, fantastic. That inspires me. I'm going to keep that now. Instead, find things like music, art, drawings, movies, books, and so on that inspire you, and keep the things that you like about them on hand. Perhaps in the form of notes, or perhaps you bookmark the images that you like on Twitter. No matter what inspires you, keeping it around to reference and look at when you want a new idea, or perhaps a new villain, a new place, a new continent, a new land, a new dimension, a new demon, a new villain, and so on. Because it can be easy sometimes to hit a bit of a dead end as a DM, especially if your party, like before, you underestimated them a little bit, they decimate the villain, and now you're like, you didn't really think that far ahead. So coming up with a backup of a backup, or a pool of something to grab a backup from, is a great idea usually. And sort of in the same vein, there's actually one more lesson. You're getting a 6-for-5 deal here. Note keeping is generally one of the most important things you can do as a DM. And you might be looking at me like, hey, yeah, I know this already. But this is an important lesson that I learned, because sometimes I have a hard time focusing and, typing in my notes about what happened or what should happen and so on. I learned the hard way about maybe a couple months into my campaign, because I was not note keeping at the time whatsoever. That the players eventually started bringing up things that I just straight up did not remember. This did cause quite a few problems. It slowed things down, or perhaps entire plot lines were forgotten or abandoned because I just wasn't taking notes, or I wasn't taking the right notes. So I had to find very quickly a method that worked for me with note taking. And my method might not work for all people. So I recommend you find your own that is comfortable with you. If you're not very good at, say, taking notes on your Google document, go ahead and get a $1 whiteboard with a $1 dry marker, and then just plaster it on your wall and be like, yes, make the villain, and have a little check mark next to it once you're done. I like to write all my notes in a Google document and then refer to them as I need them. But usually I do so in a very clumsy and fast way, but that works for me. Some people like very exact detailed notes, and others are like me where they're just like, oh, there's just evil guy in cave. Awesome. So whatever works for you, go for it. But this is the end of the video. I hope these were helpful lessons to you. If you have anything that you recommend for a new DM, or any lessons you learned in your campaign as you've ran it, or perhaps a series of one-shots, whatever floats your boat here, leave them in the comments. I'd love to hear about them, and I'm sure a lot of new DMs would like to read over some things that might help them. So I bid you all adieu. Adios.